The immaterium was a tempest of stolen dreams and screaming gods. For the denizens of the warp, it was home. For the demon ship Scourge of Unbelief, it was a hunting ground. Its hull, fashioned from fused bone and captured agony, sailed the tides of madness, its crew of plague-bearers chanting monotonous litanies to their festering god, Nurgle. Their mission was simple: to vomit forth from a planned rift near the Armageddon system and add its poxes to the endless war there. But the warp is a fickle sea. As the sorcerer guiding the vessel began to tear a hole into real space, something else tore its way out. It was a streak of incandescent fury, a comet of pure, unadulterated vengeance that did not belong. It was a scream of tortured metal and a roar of hellfire that cut through the psychic static like a knife. It slammed into the Scourge of Unbelief not with the crude physics of a meteor, but with the metaphysical weight of a divine judgment. The demon ship's Geller field, designed to keep the warp out, did nothing against this thing that was already in. The entity crashed through its spine, a cascade of hellfire igniting the very essence of the demons aboard. They did not simply die. They unbecame, their chaotic forms unwound by a power that was, in its own way, more absolute and terrifying than their own. The entity, a mangled, burning wreck of a motorcycle and its skeletal rider, tumbled through the newborn rift, dragging shreds of the demon ship with it. It fell, a falling star of damnation, into the material realm, its destination, the hellish, war-torn world of Armageddon. The sky over the firestorm citadel on Armageddon Secundus was a perpetual, bruised twilight, stained by smoke and the orbital debris of 1,000 battles. On the ground, the air was a toxic cocktail of promethium fumes, ozone, and the thick, cloying scent of orc. The Imperial Guard, the Armageddon Steel Legion, held a precarious line, their faces grimy, their lacerifals scarred. Sergeant Kalen of the 7th Armageddon peered over the rockcrete parapet, his gut tightening. A sea of green was gathering for another wave, a seemingly endless tide of orcs, bellowing and clanging their weapons, prepared to charge. It was a sight that spelled the end of the 7th. They were low on ammo, low on men, and lower still on hope. Here they come again. "Fix bayonets! For the Emperor and Armageddon!" he yelled, his voice a raw, hoarse thing. With a guttural roar that shook the very ground, the orc horde charged. It was a mindless, joyous avalanche of violence. Inaccurate but powerful gunfire from Lutus pulverized sections of the wall. Boys clad in checkered patterns and spiked armor scrambled over the bodies of their fallen, their eyes burning with a simple, pure hunger for fightin'. The Imperial line erupted in a storm of las fire and the heavy thump-thump-thump of mounted heavy bolters. Orcs fell by the dozen, but for every one that died, 2 more seemed to take its place. The line began to buckle. A hulking knob with a crackling power claw the size of a man smashed through a bunker. The screams of its occupants cut short with a wet, final crunch. "Fall back to the inner wall," Kalen ordered, desperation clawing at his throat. This was it. The line was breaking. They would be overrun, torn apart, and the citadel would fall. It was then that the sky tore open. A wound of iridescent color, a bleeding scar in reality, blossomed directly above the battlefield. From it, a ball of fire plummeted to the earth. It wasn't a missile or a falling ship. It was a thing of twisted, burning metal and a long, trailing wake of blazing orange fire that seemed to scream. It struck the heart of the orc horde with the force of an orbital strike. The explosion was not one of mere physics. It was a wave of hellfire. Green skin blackened and peeled from bone, not from heat, but from an innate metaphysical sense of divine retribution. Orcs didn't just burn. They shrieked with a terror they had never known, a primal fear of something that judged them for their very existence.
Dawa!
Energy, the psychic field of orc belief that made the impossible possible, flickered and dimmed as if faced with a truth it could not overpower or ignore. As the dust and fire settled, a crater glowed with unnatural, malevolent heat. In its center, something moved. Sergeant Kalen, risking a glance over the parapet, felt his blood run cold. A figure stood, pulling itself from the wreckage of what looked like a monstrous alien motorcycle. It was a skeleton, wreathed in flickering flames, clad in scorched leather and trailing chains that clinked with a sound like damned souls whispering. In its hand, it held a heavy spiked chain that glowed with the same infernal fire. But it was the head that stole the breath from Kalen's lungs and sent a jolt of pure, undiluted terror through his spine. Where there should have been a skull, There was a blazing cranium, wreathed in an eternal, silent scream of fire. The Ghost Rider had arrived. The orcs, stunned for only a moment, recovered with their typical brutal resilience. They saw a new, shiny, loud, and fighty thing. It was, therefore, the best thing to fight. Dozens of them turned from the Imperial lines and charged the crater, their crude choppas raised high. The rider stood its ground. It made no sound. It simply raised its head, and the empty sockets of its fiery gaze fell upon the charging orcs. The lead orc, a hulking beast with a massive choppa, suddenly skidded to a halt. Its piggy eyes widened in a confusion that rapidly morphed into abject, soul-shaking terror. It began to claw at its own face, gibbering in a tongue no one understood, seeing visions of every act of brutal, mindless violence it had ever committed, every gutted Hume, every crushed grot, every head-butted rival, now reflected back at it as unforgivable, damning sins. Its skin began to smoke, not from the rider's external fire, but from an internal combustion of guilt and damnation. It fell to its knees, then toppled over, a hollow, burned-out shell, the penance stare. The rider moved. It was a blur of fire and chain. The spiked weapon lashed out like a serpent, wrapping around another orc's neck and pulling it close. The hellfire did not just burn. It consumed. It burned the flesh, yes, but it also seared the wicked, violently simplistic soul from its shell, leaving behind nothing but ash and a fading psychic echo of a scream. It was not a fight. It was an extermination, a divine pest control. The rider carved a path through the green tide, its silence more terrifying than any orc's war cry. It was vengeance made manifest, a force of nature that did not know fear, fatigue, or mercy. Chains snapped spines and severed limbs, while hellfire turned mobs of boys into pyres of agonized repentance. Back on the wall, the Imperial guardsmen watched in stunned, horrified silence. They had heard of demons. They had been taught to fear the horrors of the warp. But this was different. This was not the chaotic, emotional madness of the ruinous powers. This was something colder, more focused, more absolute. It was law, not anarchy, and that made it infinitely more frightening. "Emperor, protect us," one young trooper whispered, fumbling to make the sign of the Aquila. "What new hell is this?" Sergeant Kalen could not answer. He simply watched, his knuckles white on his las rifle, as the entity of fire and bone single-handedly broke the orc charge, turning a certain bloody defeat into a macabre, terrifying spectacle. The battle for the Firestorm Citadel was won. But as the last orc in the immediate vicinity was reduced to a pile of smoldering ash, the Ghost Rider stopped. It stood amidst the carnage, its fiery gaze turning slowly from the orc dead to the Imperial fortifications. It scanned the battlements, the silent scream of its skull face passing over each terrified soldier, until it locked directly onto Sergeant Kalen, high up on the wall. In that moment, Kalen felt a sensation he could only describe as his soul being weighed. He saw no vision, felt no specific guilt, but he was acutely aware of every compromise, every moment of cowardice, every enemy he had killed, not with honor, but with desperate necessity. It was a feeling of being utterly, completely seen, and Kalen knew, with a certainty that froze the very marrow in his bones, that this being was not their ally. It was just... Their turn was not yet come. The rider turned away. It walked to the wreckage of its bike, placed a burning hand on the twisted frame. With a screech of protesting metal and a surge of hellfire that made the air itself waver, the vehicle reassembled itself, the tires becoming rings of fire, the engine roaring with the sound of 1,000 damned souls. In a spray of blackened earth and a wave of blistering heat, the Ghost Rider sped away, leaving the Imperial guardsmen with a victory, and a terror far greater than any orc could inspire. The hook had been set. The spirit of vengeance was loose on Armageddon, and its work had only just begun.
It's Russell. I will continue from here. Please like and subscribe if you like our content. The Ghost Rider cut a burning scar across the Badlands of Armageddon Secundus. It had no destination, no purpose other than the base imperative of the spirit of vengeance, to punish the wicked. And in the 41st millennium, the wicked were not in short supply. It found an orc patrol setting upon a stranded chimera. The guardsmen inside fought bravely, but they were cornered. The rider did not save them out of mercy. It simply saw the sin of the orc's murderous intent and acted. It was a whirlwind of chain and hellfire, and in seconds, the orcs were piles of ash. The surviving guardsmen stared in terror as the flaming skeleton revved its engine and vanished into the haze, leaving them alive but psychologically scarred, their salvation feeling more like a condemnation. Reports began to filter in. A flaming demon on a hell chariot. A skeletal judge that burned greenskins with a look. The orcs, for their part, had a different take. They didn't feel the penance stare's damning weight. They were too single-minded for true, reflective guilt. But they felt the power. They saw the showiness. To them, the Ghost Rider was the shiny Bernie boss, a fantastically violent new player on the scene. A weird boy named Zogwart, his head buzzing with energy, started babbling about the big fire git, and how its coming was a sign of a proper fight. Meanwhile, deep within the labyrinthine command bunkers of the Firestorm Citadel, the reports landed on the desk of a man whose entire existence was dedicated to analyzing and eliminating threats. Inquisitor Valerius of the Ordo Malleus, a man whose face was a roadmap of grim duty and whose soul was encased in ceramite hard faith, stippled his fingers as he reviewed the picked captures and battlefield accounts. "It is not a demon," he stated, his voice cold and flat. His junior interrogator, a fervent young woman named Livia, looked up in surprise. "Lord Inquisitor, the manifestations of fire, the skeletal form, the supernatural abilities, it fits the profile of a warp entity." "It does not," Valerius countered, tapping a grainy image of the rider incinerating an orc. "Observe, there is no randomness, no excess. Demons of Khorne revel in the bloodshed, but they are rage incarnate. This thing, it is methodical. It is judicial. It does not feast on the slaughter, it administers it. And the reports of its gaze, victims are described as being consumed by their own guilt, not by an external force. This is not the work of the ruinous powers. This is something else. An Xenos entity, then?" Livia ventured. "Perhaps. Or something far older and less categorizable." Valerius leaned forward, his eyes glinting in the low light. "It displays traits of an Alpha Plus level psychic construct, but its energy signature is unlike anything in the Adeptus Mechanicus archives. It is an anomaly, a paradox. And in my experience, paradoxes are often the most dangerous threats of all. I am classifying it as Codex, Spirit of Vengeance. Priority 1. We observe, we analyze, and when the time is right, we capture or terminate." As the Imperium plotted, the rider rode on. It was drawn, as if by a homing beacon, to a place of profound suffering. A forgotten mining outpost, overrun not by orcs, but by a warband of heretic Astartes, the Skull Takers, devotees of Khorne. They had slaughtered the civilian population days ago and now used the place as a staging ground, conducting dark rituals to honor their blood-soaked god. The air was thick with the iron scent of blood and the ozone tang of rage. The Ghost Rider sped through the main gate, its hellfire illuminating the grotesque trophies nailed to the walls. The Chaos Space Marines, clad in blood-red power armor adorned with brass and skulls, turned from their grisly work. They felt no fear, only a surge of battle joy. Here was a worthy skull for their lord. "A demon comes to challenge us," bellowed their champion, Vorlag the Bloody, hefting a massive chain axe. "Khorne cares not from whence the blood flows, only that it flows. Skull, for the blood god." The rider dismounted, its chains slithering to the ground like fiery serpents. It faced the charging champion. Vorlag swung his chain axe, a blow that could cleave a tank. The rider did not dodge. It caught the whirring blades with its bare, bony hand. Hellfire met demonic metal, and the chain axe screamed, its teeth melting, its spirit broken. Vorlag stared in disbelief for a split second. That was all the rider needed. Its other hand shot out, grabbing the champion's helmeted head. The penance stare was unleashed. For a human, for an orc, the stare showed the sins of a single lifetime. For a Chaos Space Marine, a being 10,000 years old who had bathed entire worlds in blood, betrayed an empire, and sold his soul for power, the experience was cataclysmic. Vorlag saw it all. Every murder, every act of sacrilege, every moment of betrayal, not as glory, but as damning, unforgivable transgression. He saw the faces of every loyal brother he had slain during the heresy, every innocent he had tortured, every world he had burned. The weight of 10 millennia of sin flooded his mind in an instant. The demonic runes on his armor flared and then shattered. The warp energy sustaining him was purged by the sheer, absolute power of divine vengeance. He did not simply die. His soul, already promised to Khorne, was contested, and ripped from its moorings. He collapsed, no, just a corpse, but an empty vessel, his very essence scoured clean. The other Skull Takers opened fire. Bolter shells, blessed with runes of hate, exploded against the rider's body. It staggered, bones cracking under the barrage, but the hellfire flared, healing the damage almost instantly. This was not a physical fight they could win. This was a battle of souls, and their souls were already forfeit. The rider waded into them, its chain a blur. It was not a battle, it was a reckoning. Each heretic Astartes met a fate worse than death under the gaze of the stare, their centuries of wickedness consuming them in a final, silent scream. The outpost, once a chapel of murder, became a charnel house of repentance. As the last traitor fell, the rider stood alone in the silence. The hellfire around it burned lower, not in weakness, but in satisfaction. The scale, for this one, small place, was balanced. But deep within the raging inferno of the spirit of vengeance, a tiny, human spark of consciousness flickered. Johnny Blaze, the man trapped within the curse, felt the echo of the horrors he had just witnessed. The scale of evil here was beyond anything he had ever known. On Earth, he hunted murderers and corrupt men. Here, he was punishing beings whose sins were galactic in scope. The weight of it was immense, a crushing pressure on his fragile human psyche. He was a lone, damned soul, drowning in an ocean of the 41st millennium's infinite, unforgivable sins. The spirit, however, felt only purpose. It turned its head, sensing a new, powerful source of corruption. A psychic stench of pure, undiluted rage that dwarfed even the skull-takers. Something was coming, something drawn to the challenge it represented. The Ghost Rider remounted its bike. The engine roared, a promise of damnation written in hellfire. The hunt was far from over. The annihilation of the skull-takers' warband sent shockwaves through both the immaterium and the material realm. For Inquisitor Valerius, it was confirmation of the entity's terrifying power and its apparent neutrality. It had destroyed the Emperor's foes, but with a method that was utterly alien and heretical. For the Orcs, the tales of the shiny Bernie boss, Crumpen, Ummies in spiky armor made it even more legendary. But in the realm of Khorne, the blood god himself took notice. The flow of blood from the skull-takers had ceased abruptly, not in the glorious frenzy of battle, but snuffed out by a power that smelled of judgment, not rage. Khorne despised magic and trickery, but this was different. This was a rival, a being that dealt in a currency of souls that was not offered to him. It was an insult, a challenge that could not be ignored. On Armageddon, the very atmosphere began to change. The sky, already stained, took on a deeper, crimson hue. The air grew thick and hot, carrying the metallic taste of blood. The energy of the Orcs became more frantic, more aggressive, as if feeding on a new source of violence. The Ghost Rider felt it too. The call of a bottomless well of sin. It was a siren song to the spirit of vengeance, a beacon of such concentrated, violent wickedness that it was impossible to resist. It revved its engine and sped towards the source, a burning arrow drawn to the heart of a target of pure rage. It arrived at a vast, open plain of ash and bone, a place that had seen countless battles. Waiting for it was a sight that would have broken the mind of a lesser being. A dozen bloodletters, the favored demons of Khorne, paced and snarled, their brass-covered bodies steaming, their hellblades thirsting for blood. And at their head stood a bloodthirster. It was a monster of impossible proportions, 15 feet of corded muscle and hatred, clad in brass armor. Whips made of living fire cracked in its hands, and its eyes burned with an endless, bottomless rage. Its name was Karkseth, and it had been summoned by a cabal of cultists specifically to claim the skull of the Flaming Judge. Abomination. Karkseth's voice was the sound of a million battlefields, a roar that tore at the fabric of reality. UWHO dared to steal skulls rightfully ours. UWHO wield a power not born of the true gods. Your skull will adorn my master's throne. The Ghost Rider dismounted, its silent demeanor a stark contrast to the demon's roaring fury. It pointed a bony finger at the bloodthirster, a universal challenge. The bloodletters charged. The rider met them head-on. This was its greatest test yet. These were not mortals with souls to judge, they were demons, concepts of rage given form. The penance stare flickered over them, but it had limited effect. A demon has no guilt for its nature, it is its nature. It could not repent for being rage any more than fire could repent for being hot. So, the rider fought with chain and hellfire. It was a brutal, elemental conflict. The hellfire chain wrapped around a bloodletter, and the demon shrieked as the holy, vengeful flame seared its war-born essence, sending it back to the immaterium in a burst of dissipating energy. The rider moved like liquid fire, ducking under swings of hellblades, its own attacks precise and devastating. It was a dance of damnation against destruction. But the bloodletters were numerous and powerful. One managed to land a blow, its hellblade carving a deep gash in the rider's ribcage. The hellfire flared, mending the bone, but the rider was visibly slowed. It was being worn down. Seeing its minions struggling, Karkseth let out a ground-shaking bellow and joined the fray. It brought its axe down in a blow meant to split the world. The rider crossed its arms, chains wrapping around them, and caught the axe head. The impact was titanic, sending a shockwave of force that threw both combatants apart. The rider skidded back, its bones rattling. Karksith was simply too strong, too infused with raw, demonic power. The spirit of vengeance was a powerful entity, but it was facing a greater demon of the warp on its own terms, and it was losing. No, the thought was not from the spirit, but from the man within. Johnny Blaze, feeling the impending destruction, fought back from the depths of his own prison. He couldn't control the rider, but he could influence it. He fed it his own rage, his own vengeance, not for the sins of others, but for his own cursed existence, for being trapped in this nightmare galaxy. He gave it a focus. The Ghost Rider's hellfire, which had been a pure, orange-yellow, began to tinge with a darker, more violent crimson, the color of Khorne's own rage, turned back upon itself. It was no longer just administering justice, it was expressing a pure, personal wrath. It stood, and its form seemed to grow. It looked at Karksith, and this time, the penance stare was different. It did not show the demon its sins. It showed the demon its master. It showed Karksith the truth of Khorne, not as a god to be worshipped, but as a tyrant, a slave master who cared nothing for his followers, who saw them only as mindless instruments for a pointless, eternal war. It showed the demon its own lack of free will, its own pathetic existence as a cog in a meaningless, bloody machine. For a creature whose entire being was predicated on a singular, fanatical purpose, this was the one thing it could not comprehend or withstand. It was a paradox that unraveled it. Karksith roared, not in rage, but in confusion and horror. Its form flickered. The Ghost Rider seized the moment. It lunged forward, unleashing its entire being into a single, focused blast of hellfire, now mixed with the stolen essence of Khorne's own power. The fire engulfed the greater demon. Karksith did not simply discorporate. It screamed, a sound of fundamental betrayal, and then imploded, its essence not returning to the warp, but being utterly annihilated by the conflicting energies of vengeance and reflected rage. The remaining bloodletters, their anchor to reality gone, faded away with pathetic whimpers. The Ghost Rider stood victorious, but changed. Its fire still burned with a hint of bloody crimson. It had faced the power of a chaos god and, by turning that god's own nature against him, had won. It was a dangerous precedent. Inquisitor Valerius, observing from a remote servo skull that had survived the psychic backlash, watched the entire battle. His face was ashen. He had just witnessed said an unknown entity destroy a greater demon of Khorne. The implications were staggering. This was no longer just a priority target. This was a potential weapon, or a cataclysm waiting to happen. And on his throne of brass and skulls, the blood god Khorne, for the first time in an eternity, felt something other than rage. He felt a spark of interest. The flaming judge had not just destroyed his demon, it had insulted him in a new and fascinating way. The challenge was now personal. The great game had a new, unpredictable player. The Ghost Rider remounted its bike, the engine's roar now a mix of its own hellfire and the echoing bellow of a blood god scorned. Armageddon was just the beginning. The entire galaxy was a stage for its judgment, and the eyes of gods and men were now upon it. The psychic shockwave from Karksith's annihilation did not dissipate, it reverberated, a silent gong struck in the realm of belief. The Orc-Wa energy, already a turbulent sea of aggressive intent, seized upon this new, violent frequency. It was a power so potent it had slain a big red spiky git, a being of obvious and immense fightiness. To the Orc psyche, this made the shiny Bernie boss not just a target, but a figure of awe. The weird boy Zogwart, who had been babbling prophecies of the big fire git, suddenly became the center of a burgeoning cult. His head, always buzzing with the Wa's power, was now filled with vivid, burning visions. He stood atop a gutted lemon rust tank, surrounded by hundreds of boys from various clans, all drawn by the new, exciting energy. Listenereyagits. Zogwart shrieked, green lightning crackling between his teeth. Da burn, un. I seen him. He's not a humie. He's not a spiky. He's somefin more. He brings da biggest, da baddest, da shiniest foight. He burned da red git s whole army. Wah! The mob roared in approval. This was a theology they could understand. We iz gonna find him. Zogwart proclaimed, his eyes glowing with manic energy. We iz gonna foight him. And, if we can't beat him, we iz gonna foight for him. Eizdapropah boss of Burnin, and Krumpin. Wah, for da burn, un. And so, the Wah, Bernie, un, was born. It was a heresy within the Orcish faith, a deviation from the standard goal of just fighting everything. Now, they had a messiah. Zogwart, acting as the prophet, began to lead the mob. He didn't command them with the brute force of a warboss, but with the unerring certainty of a fanatic who could feel the direction of his god. He would point a trembling, glowing finger towards the horizon, and the horde would surge in that direction, bellowing the name of their new, silent deity. The Ghost Rider, meanwhile, was a continent away, drawn to a different flavor of sin. It had come across a hidden manufactorum that had, in desperation, turned to worshipping the dark mechanicum. The tech priests here had long since forsaken the Omnissiah for the promises of demonic infusion for their machines. The air hummed with a different kind of corruption, not the wild rage of corn, but the cold, logical evil of calculated damnation. The rider sped through the main bay, its hellfire causing the possessed machinery to shriek and recoil. Heretics fired radium pistols and volkite blasters, but their logic and reason were useless against this foe. The rider's chain wrapped around a hulking, spider-like war engine, and the hellfire didn't just melt its hull, it purged the bound demonic spirit within, causing the machine to collapse into inert, molten slag. It was a swift, brutal purge. But as the last heretic fell, his mind shattered by the penance stare, the rider paused. It could feel a new presence. A vast, rumbling belief, a crude and simple faith, but faith nonetheless, and it was directed at it. It was not the pleading faith of the desperate, nor the zealous faith of the imperial creed. It was a faith of pure, violent adoration. It was disorienting. The spirit of vengeance was an instrument of punishment, not an object of worship. It turned its flaming gaze north, towards the source of this psychic noise. Back with the Wa, Bernie, UN, Zogwart led his followers to a towering, active volcano. "See," he screamed, his voice echoing over the rumble. "Da burn, uns holy land. E likes da fire, Zhu like US. We Iz gettin' close." The orcs, in a frenzy of devotion, began daubing their armor and weapons with soot and red paint to mimic flames. They built a massive, crude effigy of the Ghost Rider out of scrap metal and burning promethium at the volcano's base. They started crumping each other in ritual combat as offerings, believing their violent deaths pleased their fiery god. It was into this scene of chaotic reverence that the Ghost Rider finally arrived. It crested a ridge and looked down upon the thousands of orcs gathered around the burning effigy, all bellowing its name in their guttural tongue. The rider stopped. The spirit of vengeance was conflicted. These creatures were sin incarnate, violent, destructive, and murderous. They deserved punishment, but their belief, their twisted worship, was creating a feedback loop the spirit had never encountered. They were not afraid, they were joyous in its presence. Zogwart stumbled forward, arms wide. "Boss, we Iz your boys. We Iz ready for da big FOIGHT. Led US. Show USWHO tar burn." The rider looked at Zogwart. It saw the Weird Boy's entire life, a tapestry of mindless violence and destruction. It unleashed the penance stare. Zogwart shuddered. For a moment, his face contorted in a strange, UN orc-like confusion. He saw the countless beings he had electrocuted and torn apart, not as great victories, but as, a bit repetitive, really. It wasn't guilt he felt, but a sudden, profound boredom with his own existence. Then, the sheer, overwhelming power of the stare, filtered through his alien, simplistic mind, did something unexpected. It didn't damn him, it enlightened him. He collapsed to his knees, then stood back up, his eyes blazing with a new, terrifying clarity. I sees it. Da burn, UN doesn't want US to just FOIGHT. E wants US to punish. E wants US to burn Da wrong, UNS. Da weak, UNS. Da, UMIESWHO hide in their metal boxes. Da spiky GITSWHO worship Da wrong gods. The orc mob roared its approval. This was a doctrine they could get behind. It was just like regular fighting, but with a fancy new name. The Ghost Rider watched, its flaming skull and unreadable mask. It had not come to lead. It had come to judge. But in this mad universe, its very act of judgment was being twisted into a new form of worship. It turned its bike, preparing to leave, to escape this confusing, sacrilegious adoration. But as it did, a squadron of Imperial Valkyrie assault craft screamed overhead. Inquisitor Valerius had been tracking the massive orc gathering. He saw the Ghost Rider at its center, the orcs seemingly worshipping it. His worst fears were confirmed. The entity was not just a neutral force, it was coalescing the orcs, giving their mindless violence a terrifying focus. It was becoming a catalyst for an even greater war. The Ghost Rider sped away, the newly anointed Wa, Bernie, UN, now following its prophet, who claimed to speak for the silent, flaming god. The rider had sought to punish sin, and in doing so, had accidentally founded a religion. The war for Armageddon had just become a holy war. Inquisitor Valerius's stormtroopers hit the fringes of the war. Bernie, UN with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Their mission was not to engage the main horde, but to capture the prophet. If Zogwart was the voice of this new heresy, silencing him could shatter the Orcs' newfound unity. From his command Valkyrie, Valerius watched the tactical feed. His forces were efficient, their hellguns cutting down Orc sentries with silent, lethal bursts. They were closing in on Zogwart's position near the volcanic effigy. The plan was proceeding. Then, the world turned to fire. The Ghost Rider, having fled the confusing adoration of the Horde, had been drawn to a new, potent source of sin, the Inquisitor's own heart. Valerius was not a wicked man by the standards of his office. He was dutiful, resolute, and utterly convinced of his own righteousness. But righteousness, in the 41st millennium, was a bloody business. The Rider sensed the sin of his cert. Ain't he, the thousands of lives, some guilty, many not, that he had condemned to death by his order. It sensed the sin of the fanaticism that allowed him to see the entire universe as a simple equation of purge or be purged. The Rider didn't attack the stormtroopers. It soared up, its bike riding a column of hellfire, and landed directly on the hull of Valerius's Valkyrie with a deafening crunch. The craft shuddered violently. "We're losing altitude. Something is on the hull," the pilot yelled. Valerius drew his Inferno pistol and power sword. "Bring us down, now!" The Valkyrie made a controlled but rough landing in a clearing, its rotors snapping against the trees. The side door hissed open, and Valerius leaped out, his retinue of stormtroopers forming a protective circle. They aimed their weapons at the figure standing calmly before them, the flames of its body illuminating the dark jungle. "Creature!" Valerius barked, his voice steady despite the terror coiling in his gut. "You are interfering with the God Emperor's holy work. Stand down, or be destroyed." The Ghost Rider simply stared, its silence more intimidating than any threat. "It's trying to communicate, my lord," Livia, his interrogator, said, her auspex whirring. "The energy readings are off the scale. It's a form of psychic emission, but it's structured. Almost like a query." "A query?" Valerius sneered. "I will not parley with a Xenos wraith." He raised his pistol. "Open fire." A storm of Helgen rounds and a blast from his Inferno pistol engulfed the Rider. It staggered back, pieces of its ribcage and spine fragmenting under the concentrated firepower. For a moment, Valerius thought they had hurt it. Then, the hellfire flared, hotter and brighter than ever. The shattered bones reformed in an instant. The Rider took a step forward, unhindered. It raised its chain, but not to strike. It pointed the links at Valerius, and they glowed, not with fire, but with a cold, blue light. Images flooded Valerius's mind, not the direct, soul-searing assault of the penance stare, but a vision. He saw a world, Cardinal IX, which he had ordered exterminators upon a decade ago after a single, unconfirmed sighting of a Genestealer cult patriarch. He saw the billions of faithful citizens, their prayers turning to screams as the firestorm consumed them. He saw the faces of junior inquisitors he had executed for showing excessive mercy. He saw the cold, hard calculations that had led him to sacrifice entire regiments to save a strategic objective. The Rider was not showing him his sins to damn him. It was showing him the cost of his duty. It was forcing him to see the blood on his own hands, not as a necessary evil, but as a choice. A choice he had made again and again. "No," Valerius whispered, his sword arm trembling. "It was necessary, for the Imperium, for humanity." The vision shifted. He saw the Orcs, their new faith in the Bernie, UN. He saw the chain of events, the Rider's arrival, his own decision to observe, his failure to act decisively, which had allowed this heresy to grow. The Rider was showing him that he was, in part, responsible for the very threat he was now trying to contain. His inaction, his desire for knowledge, had allowed this cancer to spread. The Ghost Rider was judging the judge. It was a battle the Inquisitor could not win with weapons. His faith, his certainty, was his armor, and the Rider was systematically dismantling it. He fell to his knees, not in prayer, but in utter desolation. He had dedicated his life to being the Imperium's shield, and now this entity was showing him that the shield itself was stained with innocent blood. The Rider lowered its chain. It had made its point. It did not kill Valerius. Some sins were too complex for simple annihilation. The punishment was the knowledge itself. It turned its back on the broken Inquisitor and his terrified retinue, remounted its bike, and vanished into the night. Livia rushed to Valerius's side. "My lord, are you hurt?" Valerius looked up, his eyes haunted. It didn't want to fight us," he rasped. "It wanted to teach me a lesson." The concept was so alien it was terrifying. It sees everything, our compromises, our sacrifices, it sees them as sins. He slowly got to his feet, a new, grim purpose replacing his shattered certainty. "The Ordos must be warned. This entity is not a weapon we can wield. It is a mirror, and it is showing us a reflection of our empire that we cannot afford to see." The Ghost Rider had not created a new enemy in the Inquisition, it had created a new, and far more dangerous, understanding. The events on Armageddon were no longer a localized conflict. The ripples had reached the highest echelons of imperial power. The reports from Inquisitor Valerius, of an unclassifiable entity that could shatter greater demons and was now inadvertently leading an Orc war, crossed the desk of a being whose strategic mind encompassed the entire Imperium. On the bridge of the Macragge's Honor, in high anchor over Armageddon, Roboute Guilliman, Lord Commander of the Imperium, reviewed the data slate. His face, a masterpiece of bio-enhancement, was set in a grim frown. He had returned to a galaxy on the brink of collapse, and now it had produced a paradox that threatened to unravel the delicate, brutal balance that held it together. The spirit of vengeance, he mused, his voice a low rumble. A being that enforces a moral code outside the imperial truth and the imperial creed. A concept given power. His aide, a senior logister, nodded. The strategic anomaly. Sis is troubling, my lord. It displays power on a scale that rivals a Primarch, but its motivations are alien. It attacks our enemies, but it does not serve us. It serves an abstract ideal of justice that is incompatible with the pragmatic necessities of total war. The Orc War, Bernie, UN, is the immediate threat, Guilliman stated, pulling up a hololithic display of the planet. The Orc forces, once scattered and disunited, were now coalescing into a single, massive horde under the banner of the Flaming Skull. Zogwert's prophecies are giving them a direction and a ferocity they lacked before. They are becoming a spear, and this, Ghost Rider, is the unwilling point. Our forces are stretched thin, Lord Regent. The Chaos fleets press us in the Nachman Gauntlet, and Hive Fleet Leviathan approaches the Octarius sector. We cannot commit the resources needed for a full-scale purge of this new war. Guilliman was silent for a long moment, his mind processing variables at a speed that would liquefy a mortal brain. He saw the pieces on the board, the Orcs, the Rider, the lurking forces of Chaos, his own strained Imperium. We will not commit our armies, he declared. We will commit a single, precise instrument. Send a priority astropathic message. It is time to remind this spirit of vengeance that there are older, and hungrier, powers in this galaxy. The order was sent. It traveled through the warp, a beacon of pure, desperate need. The Ghost Rider, meanwhile, was trying to outrun its own legend. But the war, Bernie, UN was relentless. Zogwert, his mind expanded and twisted by the penance stare, could now sense the Rider's location with unnerving accuracy. The horde followed, a continent-spanning migration of violence and faith. They crashed through Imperial lines, not to conquer territory, but to get closer to their god, destroying everything in their path as offerings. The Rider found itself cornered in the vast, sulphurous wastes of the Ashen Plains. There was nowhere left to run. Before it was the advancing green tide, bellowing its name. Behind it was a sheer cliff face. It turned to face its congregation, the hellfire around it blazing with a frustrated, furious intensity. It would have to punish them all. It would have to stare into 10,000 pairs of eyes and show them the meaningless horror of their existence. The scale of the task was immense, even for the spirit of vengeance. As the first ranks of Orcs charged, the sky darkened. It was not a cloud. It was a shadow, vast and impossible, blotting out the sun. A deep, resonant thrum filled the air, a sound that vibrated in the bones of every living thing on the plain. The Orcs slowed, looking up in confusion. Zogwert stared, his jaw slack. Hanging in low orbit, having arrived no warp translation flare, no warning, was a craft of impossible size and ancient, malevolent design. It was a jagged, rocky mass, like a captured asteroid, covered in barbed spires and pulsing with a faint, green light. It was a space hulk. But this one was different. It was not adrift. It was purposeful, and from its surface, a single, colossal figure was descending, wreathed in a teleportation aura that shone with the cold, hard light of the void. The figure landed in the space between the Rider and the Orc horde. The impact cratered the ground. It was a giant in Terminator armor of the deepest black, etched with silver runes that told a story of endless, silent war. In one hand, it held a massive, double-headed power sword that hummed with devastating energy. In the other, it held a storm bolter as large as a man. Its helmet was a grim, skull-like visage, but where the eyes should be, there was only a faint, green, necrotic glow. It was a Deathwatch kill marine. But not just any. This was one of the few, the secret weapons kept for threats that could not be solved by armies. This was a warrior from the Deathwatch's deepest vaults, a specialist in fighting the most esoteric and powerful Xenos threats. His armor was a relic, his weapons were legends, and his mission was singular. He was here for the Ghost Rider. The giant raised his sword, pointing it not at the Orcs, but directly at the flaming skeleton. Xenos entity, a voice boomed from his helmet's vox casters, devoid of emotion or mercy. By the authority of the Death Watch and the Lord Commander of the Imperium, you are designated an extragalactic existential threat. You will submit to containment, or you will be erased. The arrival of this new, supremely powerful foe caused a momentary silence. Then, the orcs, seeing a new, big, shiny thing to fight, roared in delight. Their focus shifted instantly from their reluctant god to this new challenger. The Ghost Rider looked from the Deathwatch Marine to the orc horde, and then up at the ominous war moon in the sky. It was trapped between an army that worshipped it and an empire that had sent its ultimate hunter to kill it. The hellfire around it burned brighter than ever, a defiant scream in the growing twilight. The personal war had just become galactic. This response is AI-generated, for reference only. The Ashen Plains became an instant, three-way battlefield, a vortex of conflicting ideologies clashing under the grim gaze of the Deathwatch war moon. The orcs, ever simplistic in their desires, saw the new arrival as the ultimate test. The shiny Bernie boss had brought him a proper fight. Zogwart, frothing at the mouth with psychic energy, pointed a trembling finger at the Deathwatch Marine. C. D.A. Byrne, UN, has given US a gift. By G. Shiny, Ard Skygit. E wants his skull. Wah! The green tide, its fervor redirected from worship to pure, joyous violence, surged toward the black armored giant. They were no longer a disciplined horde, they were a force of nature, a crashing wave of muscle and metal. The Deathwatch Marine, designated Kalen of the Death Spectres, no relation to the Guardsman Sergeant, did not flinch. His tactical mind, enhanced by centuries of service and the best bio-augmentation the Imperium could offer, processed the threat. The orcs were a secondary objective, a variable to be managed. The primary target was the entity. His storm bolter spoke first. The reports were not the ragged crump of an orc shooter, but the sharp, definitive crack of master-crafted Imperial engineering. Each shell was a mass-reactive diamond-tipped round, and they found their marks with unerring accuracy. The front rank of orcs exploded into gory mist, their crude armor offering no protection. He moved with an economy of motion that was terrifying to behold, every action pure, calculated efficiency. His power sword, God Splitter, hummed as he swept it in a wide arc, cleaving through a knob and three boys in a single, seamless motion. But there were thousands of them. For every orc he felled, three more took its place. They clambered over the bodies of their dead, their war cries undimmed. Kalen was a bastion, an unbreakable rock, but the green sea was endless. The Ghost Rider watched this new conflict, its own purpose conflicted. The spirit of vengeance saw the sin in the orcs, their mindless, joyous violence. It saw the sin in the Deathwatch Marine, the cold, calculated genocide of a Xenos species, the absolute certainty that allowed for the extermination of entire civilizations. Both were guilty, both deserved punishment. But the Marine was the greater immediate threat. He was here for it. The Spirit's prime directive was self-preservation to continue its mission. The orcs were a chaotic, blunt instrument. The Marine was a precision scalpel aimed at its heart. It made a decision. With a roar of its Hellfire engine, the Ghost Rider charged, not at the orcs, but through them. It became a blazing wedge, its chain whipping out to clear a path. Orcs were sent flying, burning and screaming, not as an act of judgment, but as simple, brutal clearance. It was heading straight for Kalen. The Deathwatch Marine saw it coming. He braced, planting his feet and raising God Splitter. The rider did not slow. It leaped from its bike, the vehicle continuing on its own to plow into the orc mob, and tackled the Marine with the force of a meteor. The impact was titanic. Ceramity cracked. The hellfire of the rider met the sanctified, rune-etched armor of the Deathwatch. It was not just a physical clash, but a metaphysical one. The spirit of vengeance, a power from a different cosmology, tested itself against the absolute, faith-based power of the Imperium's ultimate Xenos hunter. Kalen was driven back, his boots carving deep furrows in the ash. He grunted, the force of the impact staggering even his enhanced frame. He brought his sword around, but the rider was impossibly fast, ducking under the blow and slamming a burning fist into his chestplate. The hellfire scorched the black paint, but the armor beneath, forged in the heart of a sacred forge and blessed by 1,000 prayers, held. Your existence is a paradox, Kalen growled, shoving the rider back with a blast from his storm bolter at point-blank range. The shells exploded against the rider's skeleton, fracturing ribs and a clavicle. You cannot be allowed to persist. The rider's only response was to unleash its chain, wrapping it around Kalen's sword arm. The hellfire seared against the armor, and for the first time, the Marine felt a jolt of pain, not physical, but spiritual. The flames were trying to burn through his certainty. Meanwhile, Zogwart saw his god locked in combat with the Sky Git. This was the moment. The Great Holy War was here. He gathered the Wa energy, drawing it from every orc on the plains, his form swelling with green lightning. He wasn't aiming at the Marine. He was aiming to help his god. "Burn, boss, burn," he screamed, and unleashed a torrent of raw, untamed energy directly at the dueling pair. The blast was not precise. It was a tsunami of psychic might that struck both the rider and the marine. Kalen's psychic wards flared, overloading and sputtering out. The rider was thrown sideways, its hellfire flickering erratically as the alien, simplistic power washed over it. The three-way struggle had created an unholy trinity of power: the ordered, sacred fury of the Death Watch, the primal, chaotic vengeance of the Ghost Rider, and the wild, belief-fueled energy of the Orcs. The very air on the Ashen Plains began to warp, reality groaning under the strain of these three conflicting forces. Kalen, realizing he was outnumbered and the tactical situation had deteriorated beyond recovery, made a calculated decision. His mission was failure. Engaging further risked the permanent loss of a priceless Deathwatch asset. He triggered his teleport Homer. Threat level reassessed. Tactical withdrawal authorized. His voice crackled over the Vox to the War Moon. Orc cohesion is now tied to the entity. New objective: sever that link. In a flash of light, he was gone. The Ghost Rider rose from the ash, its body already healing. The Orcs, seeing their god victorious and the sky git vanished, erupted into a frenzy of celebration. They had won. The Bernie UN was the strongest, but the rider felt no victory. It felt only contamination. The Orc energy had touched it, and the adoration of the Horde was a constant, psychic noise. It looked at Zogwart, who was bowing and scraping before it, and felt a new, alien emotion from the spirit of vengeance, revulsion. It had to get away. It had to find a place of silence. It remounted its bike, which had returned to its side, and sped away, ignoring the cheers of its followers. The Bernie UN had faced the Imperium's best and won. Their faith was now unshakable. And the Deathwatch had learned a terrible, new truth. To destroy the Rider, they would first have to break the Orcs. The victory on the Ashen Plains was the catalyst that transformed the Bernie UN from a large mob into a planet-wide pandemic. The story of their god physically battling a giant sky git and winning spread across Armageddon with the speed of a virus. Orcs who had been content with their local fights now felt the pull of the Bernie UN. They began migrating, smashing through Imperial and Orc alike, to join the main Horde. Zogwart was no longer just a prophet, he was a general, his visions guiding the Horde with an accuracy that defied all known Orcoid behavior. And his primary vision was now clear: the Bernie UN needed a proper throne. A place of fire and metal worthy of a god. He pointed his glowing finger towards the most fiery, metal-filled place on the continent, Hive Volcanus. Hive Volcanus was a mountain of industry built into and around a dormant volcano, its forges powered by geothermal energy. It was a symbol of imperial industry and a vital strategic asset. It was also home to millions of souls. The descended upon it like a locust swarm. This was not a standard Orc assault. There was a terrifying purpose to it. They didn't just rampage randomly. They targeted power plants and fuel depots, seeking to create the biggest, most impressive fires as offerings. They bypassed strong defensive points, using their numbers to flank and overwhelm, their strategy guided by Zogwart's psychic whispers. They were crusaders, and Hive Volcanus was their Jerusalem. Inside the Hive, the Ghost Rider had found its way, drawn by the immense concentration of sin that festered in any Imperial Hive city. It was a target-rich environment. It punished a ganger for a brutal murder, a corrupt enforcer for taking bribes, a decadent noble for his exploitation of the Underhive. It was a busy, relentless cycle of judgment. But it could not ignore the cacophony outside the walls. The roaring of the Orc horde, the explosions, and beneath it all, the psychic choir of their faith, was a constant, grating presence. It was trying to do its work, but the noise of its own unintended religion was a constant distraction. On the front lines, the defenders of Hive Volcanus were being systematically annihilated. The Steel Legion fought with their trademark tenacity, but they were facing an enemy with the numbers of an Orc and the coordination of a veteran Imperial Guard army. The outer walls were breached in a dozen places. It was then that a new force arrived. Not the Deathwatch, but the Ecclesiarchy, a mission of battle sisters of the Order of the Ebon Chalice, led by Canoness Superior Morgiana, had been dispatched by a frantic planetary command. They did not come with tanks and artillery, they came with faith and flame. Morgiana stood on a crumbling bastion, watching the green tide pour through the breaches. She saw the crude effigies of the flaming skull carried before the horde. They do not just attack, she said, her voice cold as ice. They worship. This is not mere Xenos invasion. This is a heresy of the highest order. They have created a false god from a demon engine. She turned to her sisters. We will not yield this hive to pagans. We will show them the true face of holy fire. We will purge this heresy, and we will send their false god back to the hell that spawned it. The Sisters of Battle advanced, a wall of black power armor and unwavering faith. Their bolters sang the song of absolution, their flamers spewed the Emperor's holy promethium. They met the Orc Crusaders in the shattered plazas of the Hive's outer spires. It was a clash of fanaticisms. The Orcs fought with the joy of believers serving their powerful god. The Sisters fought with the cold fury of those defending the one, true faith. The Orcs' belief was a wild, untamed thing. The Sisters' faith was a disciplined, focused weapon. Zogwart, sensing this new, potent, holy energy, shrieked with laughter. More FOIGHTS for DA Boss. Burn DA Black, UMIES. Burn, M all for, IM. The Sisters held the line, their faith forming a psychic bulwark against the War. Energy, but they were too few. The Orcs were limitless. Canoness Morgiana knew they could not win by defense alone. They had to strike at the head of the serpent. She had studied the reports from Valerius. She knew the entity was within the Hive. Squad Viridia, she commanded over the Vox. The Xenos demon is here, hiding in the shadows while its followers die for it. Find it, corner it, we will offer it to the Emperor as a burnt offering. The Ghost Rider, having just finished meting out justice to a ring of water thieves in the Underhive, felt a new presence. Not the chaotic belief of the Orcs, but a focused, zealous hatred. It was a purer, more direct form of sin, the sin of blind, murderous faith. It turned a corner and found itself face to face with Squad Viridia. The Battle Sisters did not hesitate. They did not demand surrender. They opened fire, their bolter shells inscribed with prayers of exorcism. The Emperor condemns you, creature. Their sergeant yelled. The rider raised its chain, deflecting the shells. It looked upon them, and the penance stare showed them their lives. It showed them the heretics they had burned without trial, the witches they had executed on suspicion, the Xenos children they had purged without a second thought. It showed them the blood on their hands, all spilled in the name of their god Emperor. One of the sisters, a young zealot, screamed and dropped her weapon, clawing at her helmet. I see them. I see their faces. They were just scared. But the sergeant, her faith like adamantine, resisted. Lies, demonic lies. Burn it. A blast from her Meltagan seared the rider's shoulder, the sanctified weapon causing real, lasting damage. The rider recoiled. This faith was a shield against its power. Enraged, the spirit of vengeance lunged forward, no longer trying to judge, but to survive. Its chain wrapped around the sergeant's neck, and hellfire erupted, vaporizing her head and torso. It was a brutal, direct kill, without judgment, without penance. It was simple, raw violence. The remaining sisters fought on, but they were outmatched. The rider, now acting on a base instinct of self-preservation, tore through them. When the last sister fell, the rider stood amidst the carnage, the Meltagan wound in its shoulder still smoldering. It looked at its own burning hands. It had not punished these women. It had simply killed them. The Orc worship, the imperial persecution, the constant battle, it was corrupting its purpose, twisting vengeance into mere slaughter. A new sound reached it, the roar of the Orc horde, closer than ever. They had broken through the sisters' main line. They were in the Hive. And they were calling its name. It was trapped in a city under siege, hunted by one army and worshipped by another. The Ghost Rider, the spirit of vengeance, was becoming the very thing it hunted, a bringer of chaos and death, its divine purpose lost in the bloody, faith-soaked nightmare of Armageddon. Hive Volcanus was dying. The air, once thick with industrial smog, was now a hellish brew of promethium fires, ozone from discharged energy weapons, and the crude, earthy stench of the Orc horde. The symphony of its demise was a constant, overwhelming roar, the crump of artillery, the chatter of solid projectile weapons, the zealous hymns of the Battle Sisters, and the ever-present, guttural chant of, Burn, UN. Burn, UN. The Ghost Rider was a cornered animal. The Meltagan wound in its shoulder, inflicted by the Battle Sister, was a persistent, angry scar on its ectoplasmic form, the sanctified energy resisting the Hellfire's region. Errative properties. It moved through the lower Hive's arterial thoroughfares, a spectre of fire in the manufactured twilight. It was no longer hunting sin, it was evading its hunters and its worshippers. The penance stare felt blunted, its purpose muddled by the sheer, overwhelming scale of damnation and the corrupting adoration of the Orcs. Canoness Morgiana, her armor scorched and her cloak torn, had regrouped her remaining sisters around the central cathedral of the Eternal Flame. They had fallen back to the Hive's spiritual heart, making their final stand. From the great stained glass windows, she watched the green tide wash against the fortified plaza. Her faith was a cold, hard diamond in her chest, but even she could see the futility. They would die here, martyrs to the Emperor, but the Hive would fall. High above, in the command center of the Deathwatch War Moon, Kalen observed the data feeds. The strategic picture was clear. The Werewolf had achieved critical mass. The orcs were no longer a disorganized rabble, they were a unified, faith-driven weapon. The entity was the linchpin. His initial assessment had been correct. To break the Werewolf, they had to break its god. But his confrontation on the Ashen Plains had revealed a complication. The entity was powerful, and its connection to the orcs was a source of strength for them, but also a potential vulnerability. It was not in control. It was a prisoner of their belief as much as they were zealots of its power. A new analysis, compiled from Inquisitor Valerius's reports and the Death Watcher's own observations, scrolled across his screen. It spoke of the entity's judicial nature, its focus on penance, and its apparent conflict when faced with the orcs' worship. The conclusion was inescapable. The entity's power is based on a paradigm of guilt and punishment, Kalen stated to the Logister on the bridge. The orc psyche is incapable of such complex emotion. Their belief is not one of guilty supplication, but of joyous, violent adoration. This creates a fundamental dissonance. He made a decision. It was a gamble, a strategy that went against every instinct of the Death Watch, but Guilliman had granted him broad discretion for a reason. Priority transmission to Canoness Morgiana, he commanded. New tactical objective: do not destroy the entity. Isolate it. Break its connection to the Horde. The Orc Psyker, Zogwart, is the conduit. Eliminate him, and the Werewolf will fracture. Down in the hive, the Ghost Rider found itself driven towards the central cathedral by the press of the Orc advance. It burst into the vast plaza, a sudden, blazing anomaly in the war between green and black. For a moment, the fighting stuttered. The Orcs saw their god arrive at the final battle. The Sisters saw the demon they had sworn to burn. Zogwart, standing atop a gutted Malkador tank, shrieked with triumph. He has come. Da Boss has come to lead Da Final Krumpin. For him, the Orc charge renewed with apocalyptic fervor. The rider stood between the two armies, its head whipping from one to the other. The spirit of vengeance was in agony. The sins of the Sisters, their blind, murderous faith, called for judgment. The sins of the Orcs, their mindless, joyous violence, screamed for punishment. But the collective, focused belief of the Horde was a psychic cage, pressuring it to act as their avatar of destruction. It was then that a single, high-precision laser designation beam lanced down from orbit, painting a perfect, red dot on Zogwart's forehead. The weird boy had a split second to look confused before a hypersonic projectile, fired from a spinal railgun on the war moon, struck the tank he was standing on. There was no explosion. The tank, and Zogwart, were simply obliterated, transformed into a cloud of superheated gas and shrapnel. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The energy, which had been a coherent, directed force, shattered. The psychic feedback loop that Zogwart had maintained snapped. The Orcs, their minds suddenly devoid of the Prophet's guiding visions and the intoxicating unity of their faith, staggered. The UN was still there, but the voice in their heads was gone. The purpose was gone. Confusion replaced fanaticism. The single, unified splintered back into a dozen competing mobs. They started fighting each other over the best loot, the best position, who was the biggest and best now that the Prophet was gone. The coordinated assault on the cathedral collapsed into a chaotic, internecine brawl. The psychic pressure on the Ghost Rider vanished. The sudden silence in its mind was deafening. The cage of belief was broken. For the first time since landing on Armageddon, the spirit of vengeance could think, could feel, without the static of a million Orc souls screaming its name. It looked at the chaos around it. The Orcs were still sinning, but now it was the simple, familiar sin of base violence. The Sisters were still sinning, their faith now turned to the grim task of slaughtering the confused greenskins. But the grand, heretical narrative was over. The scale was balanced. The Ghost Rider understood. Its work here was done. The war would continue, as it always did in this terrible galaxy, but the specific, twisted evil of the UN had been excised. It looked up at the sky, towards the source of the shot that had freed it. It was a cold, calculated act, not of mercy, but of strategy. But the effect was the same. With a sense of clarity it hadn't possessed in weeks, the Ghost Rid turned its back on the Battle of Hive Volcanus. It had a new purpose. It had to find a way home. It revved its engine, the sound now a clean, focused roar of hellfire, and sped away, leaving the war behind, a solitary power once more. The Ghost Rider did not leave Armageddon immediately. It spent days, perhaps weeks, a silent phantom traversing the battered world. It sought out the remnants of its unintended legacy. It found scattered bands of Orcs who still daubed the flaming skull on their banners, but the fervor was gone. Without Zogwart to focus their belief, it was just another symbol, its power faded. The rider would descend upon them, not as a god, but as an executioner, and the last vestiges of the heresy were purged in silent, hellish judgment. It visited the Firestorm Citadel, where Sergeant Kalen and his men still held the line against a now disorganized enemy. It did not reveal itself, merely watching from a distant ridge before moving on. Its debt to them, if one could call it that, was paid. It even returned to the Ashen Plains, standing at the site of its three-way battle. The scar in the earth was already being reclaimed by the toxic flora of Armageddon. The rider stood there for a long time, the memory of the conflict playing out in the flames of its skull. It had been tested here, not just by its enemies, but by the very nature of this universe. Finally, it rode to the edge of the great equatorial jungle, the one place on the planet that felt closest to silence. It was here, surrounded by the alien buzz of insects and the drip of acidic water, that the man within finally managed to surface. Johnny. The name was a whisper in the inferno, a fragile piece of driftwood in a sea of damnation. Johnny Blaze clung to it. He saw it all, the battles, the horror, the twisted worship. He felt the spirit's frustration and its ultimate, grim satisfaction in restoring a balance, however small. We can't stay here, he thought, pushing the concept towards the dominating presence of the spirit. This isn't our world. Its sins are too big, too old. We'll be consumed. We have to find a way back. The spirit of vengeance did not respond with words. It responded with a deep, resonant knowing. It had been cast here through the warp, the sea of souls. To return, it would have to sail that sea once more. It was a terrifying prospect. The warp was anathema to its ordered, judicial nature. But it was the only path. On the bridge of the McCragg's honor, Roboot Gilliman received the final report. The Wa, Bernie, UN was broken. Hive Volcanus was saved, though grievously wounded. The Deathwatch asset had been recovered. The entity, the spirit of vengeance, had vanished. Inquisitor Valerius, his spirit still haunted by the entity's judgment, stood before the holographic form of the Lord Regent. It is gone, my lord. But the lesson remains. It was a mirror. It showed us the cost of our certainty. Gilliman nodded, his face impassive. The Imperium is built on certainty, Inquisitor. To question it is to risk everything. And yet, to never question it is to ensure our stagnation. This entity was a paradox we could not solve. Perhaps its greatest vengeance was forcing us to acknowledge that some paradoxes exist. He turned to a star chart. File it under extragalactic anomalies. Monitor for any re-emergence. But for now, the immediate threat is neutralized. We have other wars to fight. In the jungles of Armageddon, the Ghost Rider revved its engine. It focused all its power, not on punishment, but on perception. It looked not at the material world, but at the layers beneath, seeking the thin, screaming membrane between reality and the immaterium. It found a weak spot, a place where the grief of the world had worn reality thin. With a final, earth-shattering roar, it poured its hellfire into that spot. A tear opened, not the chaotic wound of a warp rift, but a tunnel of blazing, focused energy, a path forged by will and damnation. It was a gamble. It might lead home. It might lead to another nightmare. It might tear it apart. The Ghost Rider did not hesitate. It sped forward, into the tunnel, into the unknown. The tear sealed behind it, leaving only the scent of ozone and sulfur, and the memory of a burning judge who had passed through a galaxy at war, leaving it slightly more balanced, but forever marked by his passage. He was gone, but in a universe as vast and dark as this, the spirit of vengeance is never truly alone. Somewhere, in the infinite reaches of the void, a new sin would call, and the rider would answer. Its work was eternal. Did you feel the heat? The saga of the Ghost Rider in the 41st millennium may be over, but the war for the galaxy never ends. If you craved the clash of hellfire and bolter, the horror of a twisted faith, and the lonely path of a cosmic judge, then your engagement is the fuel that feeds the forge of narrative. Subscribe for more tales where iconic powers are thrown into the grim darkness of the far future. Let us know in the comments which character you'd want to see face the horrors of Warhammer 40k next. Thank you for riding shotgun on this journey. The Emperor protects, but vengeance burns.